thanks everyone for being here, for tuning in, for the invitation, for your attention, etc. A bit of throat clearing before we begin. A few things here. One is the content warning. So there will be a time or two if you squint, you know, and you kind of know what you're looking for. You could probably make out a female presenting nipple. And there will also be, probably more importantly, because it's not nice to surprise people with some Nazi imagery. Nothing graphic, you know, but if you're at work or whatever, you don't necessarily, whatever your reasons are, just be aware that that's something that's coming up. And while we're on the subject, you know, I would say that this presents a tiny bit of a difficulty for me, this talk, in the sense that, you know, as someone trained in religious studies, you know, we're often given this kind of imperative, this sort of anthropological imperative. You want to be sympathetic to the subject, try to see things from their point of view, present it in a way that they would recognize. I'm going to try to do that. And that, I think, is a little, it's a little fraught in this particular case. For reasons that we'll see. I don't want to overplay it just yet, but let me go ahead and just say, in case there's any lingering doubt or doubt that may emerge, that I think that right-wing ideology is maybe even something that stands outside of the usual sort of academic protocols. It's something that's a concern to all of us. It's dangerous, and it must be opposed, cannot be salvaged or really ignored. Also at our peril. So on the other hand, you know, one wants to allow, in a general sense, for the notion that people evolve. We want to take the arguments that they make in good faith. We want to leave space even for things like irony and parody and performance, while also acknowledging that that is also like a standard, you know, plausible deniability tactic that one sees, particularly with the right in current conditions. So that's that. Just we'll bear it in mind. We'll come back to it. You'll see why. But on the other hand, while opposing the right, I think, is everybody's business. One thing that I want to also make clear here is I am not the Buddhist police. So what we're not doing here is going through and I'm going to pick out and say, well, you got this bit wrong, you misinterpreted that word. That's just not what I have any real interest in doing. I don't think that Buddhism has any political entanglements that come along with it, right? You can look easily enough in Sri Lanka and Burma and places like that and find all kinds of crazy Buddhist nationalism and things that we might not necessarily, well, I might not necessarily like very much. The general operating principle that I think I'm going to proceed along here is that if people say that they're Buddhists, that's good enough for me. We're going to treat them like Buddhists and try to interpret what they're doing as part of that sort of cultural formation. Having said that, what I want to suggest here is that the people that we're looking at are interesting for a cluster of reasons. I mean, the story itself, you know, it's a wild ride in some ways, and I'll try to truncate it as much as is possible without taking all the fun out of it. You know, this is not a biological treatment of influential cultural figures. You know, the teachings are interesting and idiosyncratic, but what I really want us to do is think of these as a case study. There are implications, I think, more or less for these three categories that we often try to use to parse the phenomena that we encounter in religious studies. And what I want to suggest here actually is that, you know, to give the whole story away here, but that what we're looking at in the end is an unusual form of traditionalism that is filtered through some ideas about Tantra, the left-hand path, and Tibetan Buddhism. And so we usually think of traditionalism as being this phenomenon that we associate more maybe with some Sufi orders, or perhaps with Catholicism, or nowadays with Orthodox Christianity, certain degree with Hinduism. We don't normally think of it as having to do with so-called left-hand path. So people that we're looking at are going to use some of these ideas and combine them in interesting ways. And I think the implications for us in terms of how then do we use these categories that's what I want to sort of have us focus on. And I'll say that the particular approaches that they exemplify might well be, and I think are, we can maybe bring that up in the Q&A if you want, found separately in a number of different other cases. So it's the combination here that makes the sauce. A methodological note here is that some of this is extremely tricky. It's work in progress, and I'm still kind of trying to piece some of this together. It's difficult because you've got these esoteric orders, which they're a part of, some of whom have public information, others have not. Some of it's probably also blinds and things like that we have to be aware of. More difficult still, in a way, is that we're looking at two people who are a couple for most of this time. They wind up founding an esoteric order and things like that later on. But especially in the time period that at least for my purposes, is the most interesting one, that is to say, the first decade or so of the 21st century, they more or less sort of go radio silent. What we have, and especially in that time period, is kind of pieced together from interviews, kind of assuming that more or less they're on the same page, because they seem to be, at least as far as we know, up until about 2015 or so, when they got divorced, amicably it seems. But there's a problem in some ways, and I just acknowledge it up front, that I'm kind of assuming that each one of them more or less speaks for the other, except in some places where I can flag and say I'm pretty sure they're on a different page. Another issue here is that a lot of what we're getting is interviews that are happening far after the fact, where they're explaining what's going on previously. And as anyone sort of who thinks about this for very long knows, those are notoriously unreliable. We tend to overcode those things. We tend to fit them into the the exigencies of the day. Anyone does. There's no way around that. But it tends to be a little perhaps overdetermined. One of them does more media than the other, so we have to contend with some of that as well. So having said all that, let's get to the fun stuff here. What we're talking about here, the reason that it seems reasonable to focus in on these two figures, who at present I think have only about, as last I understand it, maybe 400 or something devotees in their movement that they run out of Berlin, is because we're talking about the world's most famous ex-Satanist, and not Mike Warnke. No. Little joke for those of you who grew up in like evangelical circles, and Warnke was a fun guy. Google him. So no, we're talking about Zeena, now Zeena Schreck, born Zeena LaVey, seen here at her baptism, her satanic baptism in 1967, first person ever baptized, or at least the youngest person, I guess, ever baptized into the Church of Satan. So there's dear old dad next to her, and I found a picture with the altar is draped. So you're welcome for that one at least. And here she is in kind of a promo glamour shot with in front of the Baphomet sort of goat's head thing that they use. I think probably you're reasonably familiar with the Church of Satan's generalized ideology, but I want to go ahead and I'll just make one quick, very, very quick and dirty summation of this, which is to say that at least as far as LaVey represents it, at least as far as what's public, we're talking about a materialist organization, an atheist organization. The devil is a symbol of rebellion against social norms and structures. He advocates individualism and hedonism. He really likes Ayn Rand. Large chunks of the Satanic Bible are basically lifted from Ragnar Redbeard's Might is Right. So there's a whole lot of social Darwinism and all that fun stuff that's already in the mix. So, you know, we might not think of them as the most sympathetic figures per se. There's also the matter of sort of goofy hats, but that's all religions really. But how do you make these guys extremely sympathetic? Well, really all you need is the Satanic Panic of the 1980s, during which time everything from rock music to like weird fake recovered memory child abuse scandals and Dungeons and Dragons with Tom Hanks, all of this stuff is going to turn you into a Satanist serial murderer. And in the US during this time period, this was a giant industry, and the cops were really big into it, and it was a whole thing. Now, apparently, because so much of this was pinned on the supposed Satanist cult, this is like QAnon in beta mode, right? So the Satanists that are running the society and making these problems. Eventually, it seems, at least as she tells it, Zeena realizes that the Church of Satan is not sending anyone out to counter this propaganda. And so she says, like, why don't we have a PR person? And Dad says, well, why don't you do it? So she agrees, and she goes on the talk show circuit. Mostly being, presented with lots of sort of idiocy by Geraldo Rivera and these kinds of figures, and responding in pretty clear ways, in some ways to sort of expounding the satanic ideology as she inherited it, but also sort of pointing out all the various ways that the ritual abuse narratives that don't really make sense, and in fact, they're not even, they don't do sacrifices at all, much less of children. They're big on animal rights and the ecology and this kind of thing. So she's on this circuit, made such of a mark of it that if you remember this one, this was a fun little thing that popped back up again a couple of years ago, saying that Taylor Swift is a clone of Zeena. So that's another nice little thing, rabbit hole to fall down. So having got her onto the page, we have now the question of Nikolas Schreck is the other major figure that we're going to be dealing with today. Born Barry Dublin, or Dublin. He takes his name Schreck, being German for terror. He's a lifelong occultist. He's practicing Zen meditation. He's young. He's doing some stuff with the Typhonian OTO in London, some chaos magic stuff. He takes, as he reports it, initiation into some kind of a Kali tradition in 1983 or so. But where he enters our story basically is that he, as he claims, he has some experience in Egypt, where he's in 1983, he's thinking of sort of leaving the US and going to Egypt. He's going to study magic and do this thing. And he hears what he understands to be the voice of the god Set that tells him, don't be a coward, go back and fight. And he understands this means that he needs to go back to the US and fight the forces of Reaganism and the sort of satanic panic. And how is he going to do that? He's going to do this by forming a sort of a campy horror rock band called Radio Werewolf, which is named after the Nazi resistance station that was behind Allied lines. And he's going to try to embody everything that the satanic panic fears. Basically, they want a villain, he's going to give them a villain. So part of what that means, though, of course, at least in his case, I don't know why it necessarily has to be this way, but in his case, it means embracing this kind of, at least as a part of a performance art or a ritual or both. Maybe he's also serious about it, we don't know. Some ideas about Nazi occultism, and you can see here where he, it's attributed to him this idea that the Nazi leaders were occultists and trying to restore the natural order, the order of nature. Okay, so possibly this is just kind of a a thin white duke persona for Reagan's America. He also moves to Berlin, kind of when he's done with it. So a lot of it supposedly black humor and parody. And if he's asked about it now, often does not really get into it too much under the rationale of not sort of explaining art too much, because you want to leave it up to interpretation. So we can come back to some of that in a bit. There's what seems to start out as basically the fan club for this band. They're they do reasonably well for themselves in Los Angeles. And initially there's what's called the Radio Werewolf Youth Party, and this spins out in a couple of years, 1984 anyway. It seems that he founds what he calls the Werewolf Order, which is a continuation of that. And the Werewolf Order will actually outlive the band. The band more or less stops in 93, and the order continues through 99. So you can see their manifesto here, which I just sort of pulled from the internet. It's all about opposing Judeo-Christian tyranny and things like that. You can see some pretty obvious, at least sort of fascistic imagery and things like that that are part of the deal here. But potentially, it's not so different from anything that a number of other bands at the time were doing. We have a fan club that's kind of like the Temple of Psychic Youth is arguably a psychic TV fan club, things like that, right? So maybe it's just sort of part of the act. Who knows? The other thing that he's really big into is that he's kind of a Manson truther. And this is the thing that's going to continue through to this day. He and Zeena seem to first really collaborate at this 8888 event. For those of you, if you're not hip to all this, right? 88 is, H is the 8th letter of the alphabet. So then you get 88 is Heil Hitler in that kind of a code. You don't even really have to dig that deep because Boyd Rice is involved and is a notorious Satanist, fascist kind of guy. But his take, Ray Manson, by the way, I haven't dug too deep into this. I'm kind of agnostic about the general thing here, but his opinion as far as Manson goes, as best I understand it, is basically that Manson was not, that Manson was framed to a large degree. Was also sort of made a villain in a way that Manson, he says, was basically responsible for helping to cover up some murders that were more or less just a drug deal gone bad. And all the helter-skelter, starting a race war stuff, all that kind of stuff, it was just something that was kind of a red herring to try to throw people off the scent. And it worked reasonably well, and Hollywood circled the wagons. But basically, that Manson is not responsible for any of these murders necessarily. In fact, he's going to wind up coming to the position that Manson is kind of a mystic. So this is art by Nikolas Schreck for the film Charles Manson Superstar. Lots of interviews with him. You can see him kind of depicted here as if he were a Hindu or a Buddhist deity. There's a book that was first, came out in 88 or 89. The film and the book came out on the same time. This has been continuously revised, called The Manson File, in which you kind of get the idea here, the outlaw shaman. Here we have art by Zeena. She's kind of on the same trip. So they're good friends with Manson, or were good friends with Manson. And under the impression that in some ways, he was a really misunderstood character and was kind of, that some of the things that he came to, the conclusions that he came to about, cosmology and things like that, were in fact legitimate reflections of a primal truth that's embedded in various religious esoteric traditions, Gnosticism and things like that particularly. Okay, so here's a little video from, or a GIF, we're from the 8888 rally. You can see Boyd Rice up here with all of his Nazi gear. I give you this one to point out something here. Nikolas Schreck seems to have been very, very loosely affiliated with Church of Satan. It doesn't seem that he ever really bought into it. The way that they tell the story anyway, he tried to interview LaVey for a book that he was writing on occultism, and LaVey gave him, as he did sometimes to anybody that he wanted to impress, like a "you're now an honorary member of Church of Satan" card. And So he never really bought into it. The reason I give you this is says, you know, I don't worship a character in infernal regions with horns on his head and a tail. Nikolas Schreck is very clear when he talks about these things. He was a devil worshiper. He was a theistic Satanist. So he's not into the Church of Satan kind of thing. He's a real occultist during this period. So we'll see how this sort of shakes out. However, the radio werewolf order, or sorry, the werewolf order, as it were, does seem to, I mean, if they're playing a role, they're playing it to the hilt. So here you can see this is taken at the 8888 rally, and a lot of these figures will be recognizable to some of you. Boyd Rice is over here, Zeena, Nikolas. This is the guy from the American Front, which is kind of the American counterpart of the National Front. There's some, you know, anti-Semitic cartoonists and other figures that you might be interested in potentially. I'll point out, in terms of the argument that the Radio Werewolf was an act, here's the drummer, so-called Evil Willem, and he's one of the only guys in the thing, maybe the only guy, who's not doing the salute. He's actually got his like hand with his beer mug up there, so you can see it's definitely not him. He's going to leave like pretty soon after this, and he leaves, so he says, because he gets the impression that not everybody in the audience is understanding the joke. He thinks that they're taking it literally, and it's supposed to be black humor or something. So the werewolf order and Radio Werewolf are going to be basically Nikolas and Zeena after that. The two things that they say that they're very keen for people that aren't into explaining their art and what they're all about to distance themselves from psychic youth and OTO and all this stuff. They want to direct people to the Church of Satan and white Aryan resistance. It's Tom Mechter's outfit. He was the Grand Dragon of the KKK in California and had a public access TV show. And Nikolas has a habit of going on the show, simultaneously saying things like that they transcend politics with the werewolf order and that they're going to make Nazi Germany look like kindergarten. So kind of, you know, it's hard to pin down. One more example of the kind of explaining that we'll give you here. And again, hard to know what we're meant to take seriously or what could be parodic. This is the, I don't know how easy it is to read it from here. Maybe it's pretty tough. The back of the album, Bring Me the Head of Geraldo Rivera. And it's basically a little blurb about how all they want is peace and love, and everybody, all the races, and everybody to get along, and they like human rights. And so that was 1990. 1991, they released this statement about their political beliefs, where they basically subscribe to what, if you know what you're looking for, is a Julius Evola inspired idea of apolitical. They're going to present themselves as apolitical in this sense. So more on Evola in a minute. That does not mean, however, even if they're presenting themselves as apolitical, even if there's all this fluffy bunny kind of thing over here, that they are off the Nazi occultism. Oh no. In fact, 1992, they're going to go on at least Zeena books this tour of Germany to all these sort of sacred sites. She goes to Wewelsburg Castle, the one with the famous kind of black sun on the floor, goes down into the crypt. So this was Himmler's, you know, sort of castle, Himmler's Camelot, they called it, right? And she tries to do some kind of a ritual down there to understand something about the Grail quest. So she's actually not the only person, you know, to do this, but she has clarified at various points that what she's interested in is not the humans who were involved with so-called Teutonic occult orders, but the eternal phenomena which they encountered. So that's kind of going to be their argument. And Nikolas Schreck will say the same thing. He was interested in Nazism and the Third Reich because he was interested in the religious ideas and not the political ones. All right. Funny thing, who else do you know that might be interested in Nazi occultism, and in particular in Wewelsburg? That's going to bring you to the Temple of Set and Michael Aquinas. You can probably pull this from the the video afterwards if you want to get a closer look at the thing here. But he also does a working in the early 80s at Belzberg. So what I want to, this is a good point to sort of break and have a closer look at the timeline now, because now we're properly into sort of post-Satanist territory. And here I mean post in the sense more or less that Kenneth Granholm has used the term, in the sense that it is a sort of a lineal descendant in some ways, that it comes out of that scene. So what we have here, and just to kind of give you it's a truncated sort of timeline, as you might imagine, but the real werewolf order runs through 99 or so. In the interim there, around 1990, when they both leave the Church of Satan, or she leaves and he just kind of stops being around. She was never really a part of it. She becomes initiated into some form of Shakta Hinduism. A few years later, they're going to join the Temple of Set. A few years after that, after she becomes also High Priestess then of the Temple of Set, as she had been in the Church of Satan, she will leave. They both leave the Temple of Set and form their own movement. And this is around the same time that they make their conversion to Tibetan Buddhism. So let's spin this out here. Let's quickly kind of deal with the question of the Shakta Hinduism. So without getting too deep into it just now, Shakta Hinduism is a tradition within Hinduism that treats the goddess as the most important, the fundamental power in the universe. So here you can see as a form of the goddess Kali being, worshipped by the other sort of name, the so-called Hindu Trinity, right? So the creator and the preserver and the destroyer, Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. These Hindu gods are basically there, sort of paying their respects to the goddess. And you can see there's all kinds of sort of, not in most, but maybe not all of these traditions, there's a tendency towards often sort of shocking imagery in one way or another. As the battlefields, cremation grounds, often these goddesses are heavily armed, or they have accoutrement of necklaces of skulls and things like that. So when she becomes involved in this, they don't really talk about this stuff very much, actually. So it's hard to know exactly. But there's a way in which these Shakta traditions are very closely allied in a Hindu context with what we call Tantra. And by Tantra, we don't mean anything that really has to do with, it's not necessarily about sex at all, but it's something more or less comparable to theurgy, where there's the use of mantras and these sort of diagrams are called yantras. You invoke a deity or evoke a deity, either in the yantra or in the body. Sometimes in a combination of the two, you project one onto the other. Presumably, if it's anything remotely sort of normal, what she would have taken initiation to is something where there's a combination of these kinds of techniques with devotional techniques. And so I give you this image here with Kali in front of, or rather behind, this figure of Ramakrishna, who was a famous 19th century saint, who really popularized to a large degree, especially in the West, this idea of devotion to the goddess just as a mother, as a benevolent mother. And sure, there's the skulls and stuff, but like it's mom, so you're not really like afraid of her or anything, right? So that's sort of how she is. So presumably, this is kind of what they start doing in the very early 90s. There's also within this Kundalini yoga as part of it, usually sometimes you get these ritualized transgressions with intoxicants or sometimes sexual rites, sometimes human remains. Courting impurity is a way of realizing or displaying non-dualism. And a tendency towards the perennial philosophy of sorts. Ramakrishna himself says he practices at various points Islam, he practices Christianity, he declares that all this stuff works. All paths up the same mountain, so to speak. All right, so quickly, I'll just point out that there are any number of reasons why they might not talk about this too much. This stuff is chock-a-block through the kind of occult scene. You got your Kali tarot cards, any number of other traditions by things that are either sort of syncretic or people who supposedly went and took initiation to these and then broke all of their oaths and published, all the secrets. People have been on about this stuff since Crowley and then Dadaji and Kenneth Grant, some of his disciples. The sort of Kali traditions are very much part of the, almost part of the mainstream in occult circles nowadays. So we'll leave those for the moment. Although I'll point out this is still part of her repertoire as well. Zeena does these sort of Kali devotional songs, at least as recently as 2017, as part of sort of public ritual performances. All right, so circling back to the Temple of Set, just in case you don't know about these guys, we have, it's started by Michael Aquino, this guy here that's not Sammy Davis Jr. or Anton LaVey. He is part of a group that in 1975, they get sort of annoyed with Anton LaVey. They accuse him of simony, which is kind of funny on its own, of selling orders, selling holy orders in the Church of Satan. They say it's kind of lost its luster, and they break off. Aquino gets a message which he interprets as being from the god Set, who says that he's no longer willing to be identified with Satan, and instructs him to form his own order, where they're going to continue to do this work. So you can see Michael and his wife Lilith, partner Lilith, I guess, with their Sethian gear. So they're going to basically go hardcore back into occult territory for this. The funny thing that happens here is that when he does that, it's going to lead him back to Crowley. So you all know Crowley has this message that he thinks that he receives from a number of Egyptian deities. 1904, that heralds the beginning of the new aeon of Horus, more or less, or of Hippocrates. He records this all in the Book of the Law. And when Aquino has his Book of Coming Forth by Night, as he calls it, his message from Set, which of course declares him the magus of the new aeon of Set. One of the ways that he does that is he claims that he decodes this passage from Book 2 of the Book of the Law, this random string of numbers that many people have tried to decipher. He uses a very basic alphanumeric thing here, but just in first century air, Aquino breaking keys by Dr. Anton LaVey. It's not really grammatical, but you get the idea. And this is going to be the new word of the aeon. Instead of thelema now, it's keper, so becoming. And this is going to set now, no pun intended, a new continuation of the Church of Satan and a new era, which now begins. They backdate it to the founding of the Church of Satan as the era of Set. In this idea, by the way, Set and Horus, who were traditionally opposed, they merge, or Set reabsorbs Horus, or however you want to think about that. But that's how he explains how it was that he was speaking in Crowley's Book of the Law. So, and also I should point out that by Set, it winds up being the case that they mean a whole range of kind of discordant trickster gods, antagonistic gods, and so they can draw in a bunch of different practices into the thing that they use with the Temple of Set. A funny footnote here that will come back into play in a little bit. The Babylon working, if you've seen Strange Angel, you're familiar with this idea. Jack Parsons, the jet propulsion guy, and L. Ron Hubbard go out into the forest, into the desert rather, in 46, and they do some kind of a ritual with Enochian keys and masturbation and some things like that, and supposedly invoke the goddess Babylon. Parsons' plan was to impregnate this goddess with the Antichrist and bring out his own new aeon. Crowley poo-pooed this idea. But Aquino comes around with the claim, though, that he was born precisely 9 months after this happened. And he's got his horned eyebrow things. So this makes him, he's the product of the Babylon working. All right, so apparently the Schrecks are totally into this. In 1995, they joined the Temple of Set. They're still kind of on their publicity tours. They're sparring with televangelists like Bob Larson. They're working through the various suborders. Nikolas has one's working on yoga. And as I mentioned before, by 2002, Zeena's high priestess and gets pushed out or resigns, and they leave to found their own thing. So here we get to sort of now the content. That was a whole lot of setup. Same time, they published this book. And this book portends to be a manual to left-hand path sex magic. In fact, there's very little by way of sort of practical instruction here. This is a lot of, it's more theory than it is instruction. Basically, it's three parts. There's this kind of a theoretical part, one where they go through a list of different traditions in the West and sort of try to decide whether they fit into the left-hand path or not, based on these criteria they've established. And then the third part, which is the practical instructions, which they really kind of don't really give you very much. So obviously, this book is something I've been working on during the 90s. So it doesn't really push Buddhism at all. In fact, it has a few critiques of Buddhism, but if you look at the generate a word cloud from it, and if you look at this, what you'll actually see is that despite the fact that they're going to spend a whole lot of time critiquing these guys, what you find is a lot of Crowley, a lot of Royce, OTO figures. Parsons is in there quite substantially, and then some Hindu Tantric terms. So this is kind of what they're on about. Before we, his name doesn't appear here, but I have to point out that the book is dedicated to Julius Evola, and I think actually this is really kind of it's a key feature in what's going on here. So Evola, if you're not familiar with him, is a traditionalist, an Italian traditionalist in the model of René Guénon. Traditionalism, I'm just going to go with Cedric's sort of definition here, is the sense that there was practices that were transmitted from dawn of time, or should have been transmitted to the West, and were not because something went wrong in the second half of the second millennium. And now that the West is in decline because of this loss of transmission of the eternal tradition. And so everything that looks like progress and modernity is in fact decline. And what that means is for some people that they should go off and join Sufi orders and things like that. What that means for Evola, at least initially, is that you should launch a fascist revolution and try to restore pagan Europe. He tries to convince Mussolini to do this. Mussolini's not a great fan necessarily. He tries to go and then convince the Nazis to do this. They think he's also a little extreme. But he eventually kind of comes into favor and out of favor, back and forth, survives the war. And by the time we get into the 60s anyway, he's come around to this idea of being apolitical in order to sort of focus on one's own development. The other thing that's a little interesting here that we're going to see develop is that the traditionalists hold something that's kind of like the perennial philosophy. So as a rule, there's a notion that all the world's religious traditions, some of them would like to make an exception for Christianity, at least in its current form, have at its esoteric core, they're really all kind of about the same thing. To do that, we have to prioritize experience over doctrine, because obviously doctrinally they're nowhere near on the same plane, but if you look at it from some kind of experiential, phenomenological, supposedly vantage point, they're on the same thing. Most traditionalists would assert that you need, in order to access this, though, to find one tradition and stick to it. Evola is not of that sort. Evola, in fact, he's into all kinds of things, from Buddhism and Shakta Tantra, alchemy, the Holy Grail, Roman paganism, etc. This is kind of what distinguishes him, and I think in many ways this sets a template for what the Schrecks are going to do in their own sort of traditionalist development here. So very quickly, they set out essential principles of the left-hand path as they understand it. This is going to be different from Blavatsky's left-hand path or any of the other ones that you might have encountered. Also kind of different from even Granholm's ideas of the left-hand path, if you're familiar with those. Transformation of human consciousness through the manipulation of sexual currents, physical and subtle bodies through erotic rites. So that's one thing they're going to be looking at here. They're deliberately basing this on tantric or on very certain, very particular kinds of tantric traditions. But they want to specify they're not pushing tantra as such. It's just the oldest and probably only continuous left-hand path tradition. And sometimes you might need to adapt these for modern contexts. But so they're into kind of Kundalini yoga. Erotic rites, they give a wide berth to. It doesn't have to be heterosexual, but in fact, they suggest that BDSM might be most productive for Westerners because it's got to have to be about sort of shocking your system in certain ways. So there's the exaltation of the female principle, by which usually seems to mean a female initiatrix. But they want to make a clear sense that this is not feminist because they're not into egalitarianism. Antinomianism, but the traditional antinomian things that you might do in Tantra, alcohol and meat and things like that, aren't really going to be too exciting for a lot of Westerners. So they suggest that you find other ways to break your own sort of taboos and/or court public shame. It's elitist, essentially, and lastly, they want to make a claim that it's really not about absorption into the infinite or any of that kind of thing, but where you shed your ego and reconfigure it in this sort of divinized way. All right. So I think we're probably running low on time. One of the things they do then, they kind of go through and they set out different orders as to whether they fit. Here, the OTO doesn't fit, partially because even though they've now converted to Buddhism, even though they're trying to reorient themselves supposedly away from the Western tradition or so-called Western esotericism in various ways, they still maintain this kind of masculine, solar, lunar, feminine dichotomy. But they're interested in Babylon. They identify with this Babylonian goddess of the night. They also seem to have some notion that Marjorie Cameron, when she turns up at the OTO Lodge after the Babylon working, is herself an incarnation of Babylon. And that, in fact, her appearance is sort of what heralds the social revolutions of the 1960s. So this Set, the pair then of Set and Ishtar, if we take this as Ishtar, so Ishtar / Babylon, how do you want to think of that? And Set become the sort of the patron deities or the central figures in the pantheon of this new movement, which they launch called the Storm, which becomes later on the Sethian Liberation Movement, with Zeena as its high priest. So they're still kind of doing also this aeonic thinking thing, where like there's a presiding deity of the aeon, and she's the high priest of this. So there's some mixed messages nowadays. It's hard to sort of know, and again, I'm piecing this together. There's very little that's sort of been published about this. There's a Malin Fittger at Stockholm who's written a little bit on the Kundalini in the Sethian Liberation Movement. Hugh Urban and Kenneth Granholm have little portions of articles devoted to this, but there's nothing sort of broadly speaking that explains it all. It seems like partially what's going on though now is that they claim that that Set is actually Yahweh and or Allah and or Yaldabaoth, so that he's the presiding deity of the age, but he's also the sort of the demiurge, the Gnostic demiurge. So we'll kind of see how that shakes out in a bit. So they're doing this thing, and somewhere around 2002 or 2003, Nikolas is doing his meditation, and the goddess Kali tells him that he needs to convert to Buddhism, which maybe seems a little strange. He approaches a Buddhist monk about it. The Buddhist monk says, "Oh yeah, Kali converted to Buddhism long ago." The Indians and Tibetans have done this as well. So they have Krodha Kali in this Tibetan form here. They convert to Buddhism, Zeena presumably for her own reasons. The Sethian Liberation Movement, either then or later on, winds up incorporating a lot of tantric elements. So it's Greek magical papyri stuff set with some kind of tantric yoga things. And the liberation in question winds up being liberation from cyclic existence, from samsara, from uncontrollable reincarnation. So they joined the Tibetan Buddhist Kagyu school, which is the school of oral transmission. The school that emphasizes practice over doctrine, which also kind of makes sense if you think they're operating out of this Evolian framework. This school uses a lot of the same techniques that you would find in Hindu Tantric traditions, or Tantric Buddhism does the same kinds of things. You have these mandalas, they're kind of like the yantras. You have the transgressive practices of various sorts. You have goddesses alone and with consorts. You have rituals with human remains for implements. The three figures that might be of particular interest, if you're kind of looking at these people in particular, are Milarepa. They're kind of interested in him. Part of what he's famous for is for having been a black magician himself, so-called black magician, who like killed a whole village with a hailstorm, and then later on, becomes a Buddhist master. You have the current, at least they take a position on which of these guys is the current Karmapa, the head of the lineage. And then you have here Chogyam Trungpa, who is important for our purposes because he exemplifies what often in the Kagyu schools in particular, and some related adjunct schools, is a kind of what they call crazy wisdom. So Trungpa, if you're not familiar with this guy, is a Buddhist teacher in the US, but very eccentric. So he would just show up like blasted on sake and like, crash his sports car into a tree and come in and demand that everybody strip. And then, but all the while he's sort of giving like apparently somewhat lucid Buddhist teachings. This mode of being a very antinomian is something that they might appreciate about him, although they say he had some mixed results. All right, so where does this lead us? They come to a place where there's a kind of a blended tradition. And this image of the altar that I sort of started off with, you can see the Set is up here, there's various statues of Set, various Buddhas. There's a Kali tucked away back in there as well. It's a sort of a hybrid thing here. Zeena, in a column that she wrote, or as an interview with Vice magazine at one point, likens, she sort of compares Set to what's called a Dharmapala, which are these local, not always local, but with these deities that protect the secrecy of the tradition. They make sure that anybody that breaks their oaths gets what's coming to them. Sort of these wrathful figures that are considered protectors of the Buddhist tradition. So she sort of suggests that that's kind of what Seth is like. That he is, he cuts through illusion and self-deceit, and so this kind of subjects you to your initiatory sort of ordeal, and doesn't let you get away with anything. She says that she has cleared all this with one of her teachers that sort of explains to her how she can do the Sethian thing and the Buddhist thing without contradicting one or the other. She also mentions this teacher as one of her major influences. And I've included this one just because I picked it up from various little speech patterns and turns of phrase that's clear. Berzin is another Buddhist teacher in Berlin that it's clear that she has spent a lot of time listening to. She uses some of his very sort of distinct translations. Okay, so she's on the scene now. She's doing various teachings. I hate to be the guy to do this, but she's also doing a thing with the singing bowls, which is just like a tchotchke for tourists. She's doing teaching for the Sethian thing. She's doing also apparently more straightforward Buddhist teachings at this Buddhist center in Berlin. And art, performance art, music, however you want to think of it, that consists largely of ritual. Nikolas is doing kind of some of the same things, although you kind of see blurry in the background here, a similar sort of setup with the altar. He's got Milarepa here. One thing I'll point out, both of what they're doing is that they're using these mantras in a very public way. these things which are meant to be entirely secret. So there's some questions about how the art aspect of it relates to the practical aspect of it. Nikolas is more active on social media and still on the Manson thing. When Manson dies, he sort of asks people to recite mantras to help Manson to a favorable rebirth. And on their website, they're still selling all this stuff. You got your calendars, you got old school Church of Satan Zeena and Manson teas, and Zeena with Christopher Lee on a coffee mug, and even a new sort of back catalog stuff of Radio Werewolf, cleverly titled Divinal Solution. So they're not really trying to memory hole the sort of like all the Nazi kind of stuff. They kind of keep that. They're still working on that. Maybe there's some economic incentives involved. When asked about this sort of thing, at most they sort of say, well, yeah, some of it was like not so great, but it's part of the journey, So the real thing I want to sort of then, the question becomes, what distinguishes this kind of conversion, and whether we want to use that word, from others, people who became Buddhists who had significant background in occultism? So one thinks of Blavatsky and Olcott in 1880, or Alan Bennett, and around 1900. You have Alexander David Neal, another theosophist, Walter Evans Wentz, another theosophist. These are all sort of very influential figures. And even more recently, as we have John Merton Reynolds. So we have a number of these kinds of people that move from an explicitly occult context into a Buddhist context. Or sometimes they don't. Sometimes it seems like they kind of incorporate Buddhism into their own system. And so trying to figure out where we place them in this, I think what we actually see here, and I suggested this earlier, is not so much that it's a synthesis of the Eastern and the Egyptian traditions. That's the kind of thing that basically people have been trying to do since, the Golden Dawn. At least they don't see it that way. And we can ask how much we should really value this kind of subjective identification. But I think it's traditionalism in an interesting way. I think what they've done is they create a kind of Buddhist traditionalism that's based on this idea of a left-hand path. So instead of just saying there's an esoteric core to all the world's religions, they want to say that what's legitimate is this left-hand path version that has to do with goddess worship, breaking norms, and so on. There is, alongside this, the other things that make it pretty clear that they're on about traditionalism, to my thinking, is a real emphasis on lineage, on elitism, a strong emphasis on this idea of it being the Kali Yuga. So it's kind of apocalyptic, declinist notion, and a strong sense of anti-modernism. In their case, they're not as worried in the same way about things like sexual freedom or feminism or many of the other things that traditionalists would have got excised about, but they are very concerned that the modern world is destructive to the environment, that it's destructive to the way that people relate to themselves in the state. Schreck is very clear that he's a monarchist and doesn't believe in democracy and that kind of stuff. They're very, very concerned about things like they don't like capitalism too very much. The internet is bad for you, we all know. So they're anti-modern in also a kind of an idiosyncratic way. There's the primacy of experience. There's a consistent emphasis on this language of things being initiatory. They're vehement in their denunciation of Western esotericism, which is very much like what Guénon and these people were doing. Like a lot of these guys that basically started their careers hating on theosophists and spiritualists. And there's the apolitical thing in the Evolian sense. A few other things we could kind of point to, but we'll leave that there. So if we think of this as a kind of Buddhist traditionalism of a sort, what does that mean? How else can we try to understand what's going on here? Is it a phenomenon of, to kind of borrow Hodgson's idea of the Islamicate, as a way of in the Venture of Islam, he talks about people don't always necessarily adopt Islam. There's a spread of a culture and a sort of paraphernalia around a culture that can happen in a gradual way. Is this sort of kind of a Buddhistization process? Is it better to think of it as a process than as a strict sort of a conversion? Do we want to think of the question as converting to something or converting through, converting by means of this kind of left-hand path notion? There are also some questions here I want to sort of draw our attention to about notions of Western Buddhism, or sort of Buddhism in the West. People often, the literature on the subject likes to make distinctions, commonly at least between two forms of Buddhism, sometimes styled as the kind of ethnic and white Buddhism, or sort of heritage Buddhism or convert Buddhism. I think, on the one hand, this would fit sort of into the convert mold, but it doesn't look like what people usually think that looks like. It's not really very sort of Protestantized, rationalistic at all, right? They're very clear about this being kind of a magical project. It's not modernist in the same way as people think of Buddhist modernism, with the exception of the emphasis on meditation. And I think the other question here has to do with Western esotericism and how we fit people into these categories. So this is the idea that I kind of wanted to end on here. How much of this do we really hang on identification with the tradition, whether the people in question actually identify with the thing? So what I've done here is basically to say, well, it matters and it doesn't. If they say they're Buddhist, then great. And we'll use those categories to try to understand what they're doing. If they say that they're not doing Western esotericism, I'm sorry, I also don't care. We're going to use those categories to try to understand what they're doing. So I think it's the way that we want to deal with these things, or what I'm suggesting anyway, and it's not about authenticity or any of those kinds of issues. It's about highlighting what's the most salient issue at a given point, is that we don't want to police people out of categories, but we also don't necessarily want to allow them to opt out, right? We want to keep all the tools on the table. At least that's my way of thinking about it. And the same goes for thinking about these in terms of Western esotericism, that it's, I don't think that subjective identification with tradition is as big of an issue, perhaps as it might be in other wings of religious studies. But the notion of whether it's a location, an orientation, how do we conceptualize it, I think is something that does bear interrogation when you have figures like this who think of themselves as having completely left that scene, and yet are at the same time using all this kind of language of the left-hand path and initiatory ordeals and all that. I mean, clearly they're still very immersed in that and how they're thinking. Okay, so thank you. I'd like to open up for questions or comments in that